Good evening. Welcome to the Adelaide Books night at the Strand. Tonight we are presenting two of our authors, Michael Washburn with book Uprooted and Peter Gelfan with Monkey Temple. My name is Stevan Nikolic. I'm editor-in-chief of the Adelaide Books, and I'm going to say just a few words because we don't have too much time and we want to hear from authors about what they say about their books. You never want to hear what editor think about your book. That's not the right thing. But in any case, I'm going to say one thing. Why did we put these two authors together? As publishers, we have motto that says we don't publish classics, we create classics. It sounds arrogant and pretentious, but it's not, because in today's world, subculture is taking over culture. And if we look around ourselves, and if we look at the New York Times bestseller, there is not much we can see there. And also, if we look at the front pages of any major newspaper in this country, there is not much that we can be proud of to look at. So we do have responsibility, each of us in our own business, as publishers, we have responsibility to bring quality to reader, true quality, something that's going to stay behind us. And one thing that these two authors have in common is they're looking, themes of their books are universal. Their themes, they're not consideration of our generation, but of generations to come. And questions that they're asking, they're basic human questions that we keep asking every day. Where are we coming from, and where are we going? And what is that we lost? And where are we going to find it? And answers on those questions, a bit of those answers you're going to find in their books. And now they're going to talk about that. Thank you.
I would like to extend my thanks to my publisher, Stevan Nikolic of Adelaide Books, to the Strand, and to all of you who turned out tonight. The theme of uprootedness has fascinated me for many years. When I lived in Philadelphia early in the millennium, I researched and wrote a cover story for the Philadelphia City paper about the Vietnamese refugees there. Although relations between their country of origin and ours were thawing, they still had extremely vivid memories of persecution, danger, and trauma. As my personal acquaintance with them grew, their stories of flight and resettlement affected me deeply. Jumping forward in time, refugee crises and the displacement of populations have dominated recent headlines. But uprootedness is not just something that refugees know. Without taking sides in the rancorous political debates of the moment, it was widely noted that one of the candidates in 2016 appealed to voters who were uncomfortable with the changes they saw happening around them, and some of whom perhaps felt, rightly or wrongly, that they were no longer at home in their own country. Uprootedness is perhaps above all a philosophical and spiritual condition. The Iliad and the Odyssey are about more than one kind of exile and return. The stories and novels of Vladimir Nabokov feature characters who are exiled or lost in a geographical sense, but they are literally full of men and women trying to make their way in the strange terra incognita of the human psyche. The tales of H.P. Lovecraft, which have gained increasing critical respect over the years, tell us of races of beings displaced or forced out of places they have long known. But again, it is philosophical and spiritual uprootedness that stands out. None other than Joyce Carol Oates has found in Lovecraft's work, quote, a curious elegiac poetry of unspeakable loss, of adolescent despair, and an existential loneliness so pervasive that it lingers in the reader's memory like a dream long after the rudiments of Lovecraftian plot have faded, end quote. So on that note, I'm going to read 3 excerpts. And the first is from a story called The Detour, which is about a young American, Jack Mahon, lost in Romania at a time of heightened international tensions. He meets a strange man named Cuza who doesn't seem to like Americans, and then he meets a young woman named Mirella. As she was neatening up the loft of her barn on the farm for Jack, Mirella said she wanted to show him something. While Jack sat on the bed in his underpants and t-shirt, Mirella vanished, then returned with a wooden chest, its clasps darkened with rust. After setting it on a stool between her and Jack, she flipped the clasps and withdrew an ivory statuette, 2/3 the size of a newborn infant. It was the likeness of a person of indeterminate gender, Jack thought at first, with arms raised straight and outward as if to hold a big vessel, which might or might not have been part of the statuette before breaking off. Then Jack thought, no, the figure was not carrying anything in those outstretched arms. It was just overcome with joy at seeing somebody. It seemed in the throes of a profound love. Something about the contours of its cheeks, as well as the quality of the eyes, suggested to Jack that the figure was female. He stared at it, then told Mirella that surely certain people would want something this rare and beautiful behind glass in a museum if they knew about it. It must come from the remote mists of Romania's Neolithic past. You just never know what you'll find in the caves in these parts, she told Jack. He kept staring at the figurine, trying to clarify his reaction to it. Mirella kissed Jack on the cheek before stealing down the ladder and out of the barn. He was alone in the loft with the figurine. Jack replaced it, turned out the light, and lay flat on the bed, looking up at the decaying beams. Beyond the window in the loft, all the land was black and silent. As he drifted off, the vastness of space above him in the loft seemed to extend for miles. And then he was aware of a face way up there, as if the dark were answering his gaze in the thrust and parry of conversation. He tried to ignore the watcher and turn his gaze downward, and then he was lost in darkness, away from the loft or from any refuge. He saw the figure of Cuza hobbling along the boulevards of Europe, speaking bitterly about Jack and all Americans. Jack felt cold as he drove away the image of Cuza, only to slip further, to find his consciousness segueing into another setting, which was unmistakably a city in the throes of a blackout. Somewhere lights were blazing, they must be, because he could detect contrasts of shapes, movement when someone stumbled past him a few feet off in the void. Here was a shape, a man older and more wizened than Cuza, passing by without a look at Jack. Then a party of 5 or 6 men whom he guessed were miners because of their helmets. At intervals, there came other faces, not distinct enough to make an impression before the dark engulfed them again. A cacophony of voices arose from a distance he did not try to quantify. It might have been 2 blocks or a mile. Voices invested with the urgency of those who know what it is necessary to do but cannot make others understand. As Jack advanced, the density of the shapes around him suggested that he might be close to the heart of the city, but then he guessed they might just be warehouses. He entered an area where he could not make out his hand in front of his face, but then passed back into the realm of intermittent lights and stood listening to the cries. Jack marveled at how far his hearing extended, to places in the dark city, to a realm beyond it where the life of the city dwindled to a slow dripping over stone, down almost to a zone of the earth where tectonic plates had slammed together ages ago, resulting in all manner of spatial and temporal abnormalities. If he strained his ears hard enough, he believed he could hear sounds from the hills and pastures all around, young men and women in homemade pants and smocks who met in private and produced a new generation that would grow up and make its way to the city, once an agglomeration of castles and moats, now a sleek modernist landscape with pavilions where soldiers marched beneath a podium, where a cosmopolitan nationalist in a designer jacket and tie rallied the nation behind an effort to transform the industrial base, launch men into space, deploy missiles, hobble a continent through painting and dance and song. Jack could hear all the life of the nation if he chose, but he wandered further amid the shouts and alarms in the dark. In the morning, rain beat on the barn's roof, thick drops that splattered and burst, and all was gray and barren outside. Jack opened the chest and looked at the statuette. How it appealed to his sense of love between mortals. He thought of the handful of people he'd known who had died in their teens and 20s, and the infinite meaning with which their relationships must have become invested in that window of time in which they could flourish. Oh, there was something about that figurine. Now I'm going to read a passage from After the Storm. And this is about a boy who runs away from home in his little town in Louisiana in the aftermath of a hurricane. And it begins with a flashback and then jumps to the present. One afternoon, when most of the other kids had gone home, Chris wandered into the bush on the far side of the pier to find a spot to relieve himself. When he was done, he began to emerge again from the bush, then froze. A pair of kids stood on the pier in the waning light, with pants and shirts rather than trunks on their sleek young limbs. They were almost exactly his age, but he'd never seen them in all his months of coming here. Without warning, one of them hoisted a tan sack and tossed it 20 feet through the air. It clapped into the water and sank. The two boys turned and walked off the pier and up the gravel path through the pecan trees to the road. Before they were even out of sight, Chris had stolen over the rocky clay lapped by the water, moved into the depths of the lake where the sack lay amid a cluster of rocks and shells. He spirited it to the surface and returned to the beach with it held aloft in both hands. Again, he passed into the bush, where he laid the sack at a wide, flat rock and opened it. One of the tiny kittens was orange, the other gray with white streaks, neither of them larger than an adult's hand. The orange one had luminous, caramel-colored eyes, suggesting an emotional sensitivity Chris hadn't thought even the most intelligent animals had. He watched their tiny bodies heaving, processing the air. He petted their heads as gently as he could, whispered to them. Of course, he couldn't talk in a way that made sense to them, but his mom had sensed something about how animals understand your tone. Chris put his shirt back on before carrying the kittens for just over a mile to the house on the muddy lane. He made a nest for them between his bed and the window looking out on the backyard. That night, Chris's mom summoned him into the living room, where he discovered her boyfriend, Rick, with his arm around her. Rick gave the boy money and told him to run to the corner store and buy a six-pack. When he got back, the three of them sat in the living room. "We'll make a man out of you yet," Rick promised. The first time Chris sipped beer, he thought it was the vilest thing he'd ever tasted. Now in the present. He could not see his hand before his face. Slowly, he clawed and pushed his way upward until he stood upright under the stars. He ate the last of his candy, so that all he had left to eat was a hunk of bread. Again, he looked around, and the biggest concentration of lights and buildings was down the coast to the east. After an hour of walking, he came to a cluster of 1- or 2-story houses it would almost be fair to dignify as a town. He thought, "I can't get caught." There was too much nervous energy coursing through the boy for him to slow down. He pressed ahead, nibbling at the bread, until he came to a town proper with at least 8,000 residents. Beyond the gas stations at the outskirts, he happened upon a town square with a statue of Huey Long, at whose base was a fountain choked with cigarette butts and wrappers. No water issued from any of its 4 mouths. Beyond the fountain, he met an empty church and a motel and a bar, from which came roars of laughter and cursing as men bantered or watched the action on a screen. As he crossed the square, he noticed a curious thing in his peripheral vision. At first, it looked like a discarded mannequin, for it lay pale and utterly still in the beam from one of the lights flanking the square. But upon inspection, it was a man who'd passed out, in his 40s, in a cut-rate sports jacket, with one of his shoes dangling from a twisting foot in the dust. Chris scanned the square and the approaches to it. He thought that if he didn't take the man's wallet, another passerby would be happy to do it. Gingerly, he approached the prone form, as it occurred to him that maybe the man wasn't breathing at all. He didn't want to acknowledge what he was feeling, that the form reminded him of someone in his past. "Hey, what are you doing, kid?" 2 men had emerged from the bar while he studied the form on the ground. They were both fat and middle-aged and had tattoos on their arms. They looked like they wanted to bash his head open. In a movement so fast that the men did not see it, Chris dashed up the path between the bar and the church and plunged into the bush beside the road, where they would have needed infrared radar to follow him. He could hear the 2 men cursing and roaring, but he knew that compared to them, he was like the Greek god Hermes in a coloring book Rick had given him once, when Rick was getting to know his mom and trying to impress her with his generosity. Chris moved through the bush for as long as he could fight off his anxiety that a branch would go through his eye. Then he returned to the road, luminous under a full moon. On either side, the shacks and houses were somnolent, with no lights in any of the windows. His throat was so dry he felt tempted to lap the muddy water off the ground. Finally, I'm going to read from Luster. This is a story about a young man, a rather dislikable young man, at a film festival in the south of France. At the beginning of the story, he insults a party of strangers, and this sets in motion a chain of events. And this passage is from later in the story. The streets were every bit as dense with gaping tourists as he expected. He made his way 2 blocks south toward the water, then a block and a half up a street wending more or less parallel with the coast. He saw a sign in the window of Armand's store. The owner would be back in 15 minutes. Well, Armand must have his Zinfandel and foie gras, Griffin thought. He reeled at how fast his feelings toward Celine were hardening now. He had been pretty magnanimous toward her, buying all the drinks they had together, showing her his suite, making love to her passionately in the face of something pretty close to indifference on her part. And her questions, they didn't flow from coy, playful cynicism. They were probing, suspicious, insolent. He walked to a cafe 3 doors down, where to his surprise, he spotted a vacant table roughly in the middle of the place. Griffin sat down and ordered coffee. All around him were veritable clones of the young cineasts he had heard that morning discussing films and directors and the festival. Everyone was so happy, so involved in the moment, yet Griffin suspected that somewhere out there in the town, strangers harbored rage toward him. He remembered now that he left a matchbook from his hotel behind when he left that cafe about 12 hours before. A couple of the young people at the next table, on the side closer to the long open window, were looking at Griffin curiously. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women with a lot of gear propped against their chairs. They were practically kids. The guys had a business casual look with their chinos, short-sleeve button-down shirts, and loafers. One of them wore a beige vest that would have been uncomfortable 3 hours earlier, but the air was cooler now. Another had dark, bushy hair like a 70s psychedelic rock fan. "Are you guys with Paul Michaud?" Griffin asked. They laughed in unison. "Don't we wish we were," said the one in the vest. "What's that in the black case by your knee? You have no idea?" "No, tell me." "It's a Snapcorder 788X. I defy you to name anything more advanced. It captures how people occupy space like nothing else I've ever used." "I'd like to hold it. I know how that sounds, like I'm saying I want to fondle it," Griffin replied. The party of 5 laughed again. "Your question is exceedingly odd. What project are you involved with?" "We're ADs and crew for a documentary about the festival." Griffin tried to look as ingenuous as possible. "A documentary about this event. That's a brilliant idea. Do you have any idea who I am?" The youngsters looked at each other. "I'm afraid not, sir," said the one in the vest. "Well, you must have heard of Lawrence Fowler. He's the editor of Film Tech, a magazine devoted to the production side of cinema. I write for him on a freelance basis." They were looking at Griffin with unabashed interest. He took out his card and laid it face up on the table. "I can give you some nice coverage." Again, they exchanged looks. "Really?" "Oh, yes. Why do you think I'm here, to snort coke?" "Well, a story in Film Tech would be like the most amazing thing that could make our careers. I can spot incipient talent. And there are already plenty of people covering Paul Michaud. We need to cover work that's got a technological edge." The young people spoke at once. "That will be totally amazing, brilliant, incredible." Griffin nodded. "One thing, I'm on a really tight deadline." "I can imagine," said the guy in the vest. "So do you think I could borrow the camera?" Once again, the young people exchanged looks. The kid with tousled hair lifted the camera into his hands and handed it to the guy in the vest, who passed it without indignation to Griffin. Holding the case with its sleek, expensive cargo, Griffin reflected once again that insidious on every continent, there were guys who could barely hail a cab on their own, but who gained sudden power, instant relevance, through an association with the agending set of publications. He thanked the kids, clutched the case in both arms, and slid through guests, clutching wine glasses uncertainly, until he was out on the broad avenue again. He darted into Armand's, came out moments later with a bottle of Pinot Grigio in a plastic bag, and moved aggressively through the crowds. He realized now how oblivious he'd been of his surroundings. If Griffin had bothered to look just a few feet ahead and to his left, he would have seen the actress sooner. His first thought was that here was the same performer he'd insulted in the cafe that morning. But he quickly saw this was not the case. The young lady to his left had pale, radiant skin, and she was a brunette. The reporters and cameramen who formed a moving semicircle in front of her appeared to think that Griffin was with her. A few of the reporters even appeared hopeful of getting a good quotation or two from him. Well, he wouldn't disappoint them. "We need to upend the old commercial structures," he said to the glare. the intrusive microphones. Here is a moment virtually without precedent in the history of film. I know that we all like what we like, and it's considered supercilious to pass judgment on all the Hollywood franchises, and I'd just been reinventing the wheel anyway. This festival has been around since 1946, but here's what's different. A documentary is in the works about this festival and why it may finally encourage directors not to do what innumerable other brethren have done. So much change is underway. I predict that Paul Michaud will not do what David Cronenberg, Brian De Palma, David Lynch, and in our own generation, Denis Villeneuve, and other tragic, talented directors have done. He will not answer the call of the big studios after the success of his first two indie features. Oh no. He'll know that this is the only element in which Paul Michaud can really function and flourish. This town is where his work meets an intelligent response. And the notion of him moving west, drifting over the sea like a balloon, and taking root in crass commercial soil would be a hoax as preposterous as anything Edgar Allan Poe ever concocted. It was total bullshit, but Griffin said it with conviction. Back in the suite, Celine's cool, appraising eyes greeted him. He averted his eyes because he didn't want to feel her scrutiny as he pulled the wine out of the bag and positioned it on the counter. He proceeded past her, muttering about a friend who was on his way to a party and wanted Griffin to hold the camera so as to avoid getting coke into its nooks. As Celine busied herself with the wine, Griffin opened the door of the closet beside the bed. He removed the snap quarter from its case, turned it on, and rested it on the middle shelf at the rear of the closet with a lens facing out toward the balcony. Then he lodged the case in such a position that the door stayed about 2/3 closed. Celine joined him in front of the bed. She handed him a glass. From the way she sipped her wine, he could tell how unerring his choice had been. I'm terrible at expressing myself, but something about your beauty is just cinematic, he said.
Can you all hear me without the microphone? I will use it. Is it working? Yes. Okay, my release tonight is a novel called Monkey Temple. Monkey Temple tells the story of two longtime good friends and rivals, Jules and Ralston. They're in their late 60s, maybe early 70s. They haven't seen each other for a while. And they're brought together by the funeral of a mutual friend that Jules is presiding over. Now, Jules and Ralston have had very interesting, varied, adventurous lives. They haven't trod the normal paths. They've followed their own passions and dreams. And their lives have had a pattern, the two of them together, of I need two hands for this, of coming together and then going apart, coming together. And the pattern is usually that they come together, they collaborate on something or live in the same place, and then they have a terrible falling out. And they go their separate ways, and they don't see each other for maybe years. But then they get back together, maybe they travel together for a while, and then they have a terrible falling out and don't see each other for another 5 or 6 years. And this pattern has repeated itself over and over and over again. They were driven by purposes and dreams. Jules was the kind of hippie who was interested in the philosophical, the spiritual. He wanted enlightenment. He wanted to find the ultimate reality that lies outside this illusion that we're all thrashing around in. Ralston, on the other hand, was the other archetypal hippie. He was the social activist, and he wanted to make this planet a better place to live. And because of the funeral and you know, they've been thinking, and their ages, they know their lives are coming to an end, and they're sort of mulling this over to themselves. And they're not happy. They're not satisfied with their lives, no matter how adventuresome and how fun their lives were, and the amazing things they'd seen and done. They weren't satisfied because they hadn't achieved what they set out to do. Jules never found nirvana, and Ralston looks around the world of today and thinks it's not much better than the world that he grew up in. And so it's like they had a wonderful journey, but they never got to their destination, and that was important to them. So what are they going to do? They decide to go on a road trip. And most of the novel, Monkey Temple, narrates this road trip. Now, this road trip was very fraught for both of them. There were layers for both of them, layers of intent and motivation. At the top, at the most superficial level, they both had a pretext. The pretext was nonsense, and they knew it, and they were pretty sure the other guy's pretext was nonsense. However, the pretext served the purpose of getting them into the car and driving away together. Okay, so now they're on the road, and they know what they're on this trip for, and they think they do anyway. But sorry, but after a while, it becomes apparent, or I hope it becomes apparent, that there's something underneath all that that's driving them, something that they probably aren't really fully aware of, but some other drama is playing out. And the trip gets pretty strange after a while. They meet up with old friends. They meet some new friends. Jules's wife, who is an important character in this book, is with them for some of the trip. And then what happens? I'm sorry, I've run out of time to synopsize this book, but you know where you can find out what happened. Oh, but there's one more thing. There's a reading, so I will do a reading. I actually don't think that writing novels is a performing art. But then we have readings. You know, normally if you go to a performing art, like a concert or a play or even a movie or a dance recital or something like that, the performers set the pace, and you either keep up or you don't. But if you go to an art gallery, say, you might look at one painting for 10 minutes, read the notes on the wall about it, maybe look it up in the catalog you've got in your hand, and then you go to the next one and you see it, and you get it right away, and you laugh, and that's fine. You don't need to do, and in other words, you do it at your own pace. And I think reading a novel is like that. Some things you read fast, some things you read slow. Sometimes you stop and think about what you've just read. Nevertheless, a reading was promised, a reading shall be had. I've got two short excerpts from different parts of the book. The first one is the opening scene. What the hell was Ralston doing here? I could see him coming a block away. He moved with the same antsy saunter, scanning the landscape, zigzagging slightly, when a woman, a ferret on a chain, a pastry shop, then 4 kids on one bike caught his interest for a moment. But his legs, whose rubbery flexibility used to give him the bounce of a cartoon sailor, now seemed firmly in the jealous grip of his hips. His hair fell to his shoulders in a fringe, gray and wispy now instead of dark and wild. He cut it short for a few years in the early 70s, after truckers, construction workers, and clean-cut kids started wearing theirs long. But then he let it grow out enough to tie back in a stumpy ponytail. I stood up from my sidewalk espresso. Ralston caught sight of me. "Jules!" He veered into the cafe and gave me his usual greeting. "Still mad at me?" We shook hands and slapped shoulders. His hand felt warm and firm, but the shoulder seemed bonier. I patted it again more gently. I remembered the ponytail breaking free in the late 70s, downtown on Broadway, across from Trinity Church, when Ralston had spotted another ponytail, this one coiffed and conditioned, swaggering behind the Wall Street type. In a perfectly fitted suit, carrying a hand-tooled leather briefcase into a waiting limo. Without hesitation, Rawls had stripped the rubber band from his hair forever, looped it around the tip of his index finger, pulled it back, and shot it at the limo. Ponytail Esquire hadn't blinked as it ricocheted off the tinted window 6 inches in front of his face. Now Ralston looked around. Where are they holding this ghoulish farce? I pointed across the street. He grabbed my cup and chugged the remains of my coffee. Break a leg. And then they go off to the funeral. Excuse me, Mom. I should probably put my glasses on anyway. Okay. Now we're going back 50 years. We're going back 50 years to an island in the Mediterranean. Dunga chica chica chica, dunga chica chica chica, gung chica chica. Full moon at Australian Junes. Candles and hash pipes flicker. Congas boom and bongos bop. White-clad freaks balance in a slow moonlit procession atop the stone walls, striking lunatic poses, blouses billowing in the breeze. An onomatopoeia of drums, dumbeks, tablas, tom-toms, tambourines, African drums, homemade drums, wooden, metal, clay drums. Someone taps a wine bottle with the back of a knife. A flute darts between the beats, then soars above, is joined by another. Hands pounded numb, I ride the beat into the night. Dung chicka dung chick, dung chicka dung chick, dung chicka dung chick. Inside a stone room, dimly lit by a few candles and kerosene lamps, 30 drummers pack the floor. Smells chink the sound surface, incense, smoke, spice, stone, the skins of the drums and of the drummers, sweat, musk. Tea and smoke slowly circulate. Drummers come and go, but the sound remains unbroken. See it with your ears, a thick snake uncoiling, sliding out the doors and windows into the night. In a bedroom, John Puchatoki reclines regally, torchlight glinting off his muscle-packed, sweat-misted torso. 4 half-naked, zombie-eyed women crawling all over him. John Puchatoki's story, a 97-pound chronically ill 2-bit hustler, left Harlem for Mexico to breathe dry desert air and score some dope to sell back in the States. Burned and busted, jailed in the Mexican outback, he fell in with some Yaqui Indians who taught him the secret art of Puchatoki, a system of mental and physical discipline that brings about spiritual awareness, physical health, strength, and power over women. The Yaquis cured him, built up his body, and made him what he is today. Da-da dunga chica chica, da-da dunga chica chica, da-da dunga chica chica. Outside, not even the olive trees can stand still. The moon rises higher and higher above the writhing green sea. Everything's slick with youth and sex and rhythm and flow and the ecstasy of possibility. Tonight's lesson, John Puchatoki has something going for him. The rest of us don't.
If you have any questions for authors, now is the time.
I guess we're done.
Someone has a question.
Is the past or present or some combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two. These two guys in present time are off on this journey, and they're ruminating about the past and remembering the past.
So Peter, is this inspired by your, hello, hi, Peter. Is this book inspired by you and your friend Trevor Meldal Johnson by chance? So Ralph's a fabulous writer.
Inspired by. Oh, let me get the mic here. Inspired by, but it is not. A lot of the book is taken from things I saw, people I knew, and all of that. But it is not my story. I am not Jules. I am not Ralston. Their story and their journey was not mine. but I borrowed a lot, and a lot of the scenes, including that one that I just read. Yes, Trevor was a dear friend of ours who died some years ago, and yes.
Yeah, fabulous.
That's the one-word answer to your question. Yes, but inspired by, not. Helen. There are 2 monkey temples in this book.
Okay, one question for both of you that I would like to hear an answer. How much is of you, of your own life, into your books? Just how much is autobiographical? I know you answered that partially, but you wouldn't get these questions if people don't know you. Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. Well, the author Nicole Krauss wrote a short story, was published in the New Yorker. It's called The Young Painters, and the way I read it, it's precisely about this question. And I think the message of the story, my interpretation, is that even if you choose subject matter that don't really seem to have much to do with the life that you've lived, the choices that you made are still not arbitrary, and they flow from your own preoccupations and concerns that naturally grow out of your personal experience. And I think uprootedness to some extent is a universal condition. I think it's something that we all can attest to. And even though I may not have been to all the places that I write about in my stories, in another sense, on another level, I have been there.
I guess it was something similar to what I've already said, and what Michael said, that a lot of it you draw from your life, but it doesn't mean you are writing about your life. You often hear people tell writers, write what you know. I think that's absolute nonsense. You should write what you're interested in. You should probably write about what you want to know about, but write what you know. But write what you know is very, very useful for the background. If you want to write about a city, it might be good to go to that city so you can actually describe it. In my earlier novel, the hero, the protagonist, was a photographer. That fit in nicely with the themes of the story, and I could write semi-knowledgeably about photography, so it was handy. The town it was set in was a pastiche of other towns that I have lived in, so I could write knowledgeably about it. And that's the same with this book, that it's authentic, but it's not my story, it's not me, and it's not. I hope I've made that clear. Did you have a question? Oh, you're just.
Any more questions? If you could just raise your hand, I can run the mic to you.
Hi, I remember from the first book finding out, not necessarily about your life from the book, but finding out interests that you had, as you were saying, interests. I don't know, it could have been stamp collecting, it could have been anything. But interests that you had that I had never known that you had had. And that kind of contributed to what I like to think of as my knowledge of you. But it was interesting because they were aspects of your life or aspects of things that you become interested in and learned about that I never knew anything about. And that actually did change the way that I'm not the book so much, but you, unfortunately. Anyway.